Lights down. World off. The shadows are waiting. Let your mind travel back. Imagine a world not just brought to its knees, but fundamentally unmade. A world where the very air you breathed felt poisoned, where families abandoned their own, and where the most powerful institutions crumbled under an invisible assault. This isn't a dystopian fantasy. It was the grim reality of 14th century Europe. For centuries, its societies had been built on intricate hierarchies, unwavering faith, and established wisdom. Then, a microscopic predator, smaller than the eye could see, arrived. It didn't just kill millions, it shattered the foundations of an entire civilization, paving the way for a new, often terrifying, but ultimately transformed world. What if I told you that the greatest catastrophe in recorded history wasn't a war or an earthquake, but a tiny bacterium carried by a flea? Tonight, we're plunging into the cataclysmic story of the Black Death, not just how it decimated a continent, but how its silent march through cities and souls irrevocably reshaped humanity itself, leaving an indelible mark on everything from our DNA to the very concept of public health. Get ready, because the echoes of this ancient horror still reverberate in our modern lives. Our story begins far from Europe's bustling cities, in the profound, silent expanses of the Central Asian steppe. Picture an endless ocean of grass under an indifferent sky, where a secret pact had existed for millennia. A microscopic organism, known today as Yersinia pestis, found its home in the bloodstreams of countless burrowing rodents, marmots, gerbils, ground squirrels, thriving in their vast underground colonies. It wasn't a monster in its own world, merely a fact of a stable, brutal, natural cycle. The mechanism was elegantly lethal. A flea would bite an infected rodent, ingesting blood teeming with bacteria. Inside the flea, the bacteria multiplied so rapidly they formed a gelatinous blockage in its gut. Perpetually starving, the flea would bite frantically, regurgitating a deadly slurry of bacteria directly into its next host. This was the fire beneath the earth, largely invisible to humankind. But the world is never truly static. In the early 14th century, two immense, unrelated forces converged to shatter this ancient equilibrium. First, the climate shifted. The medieval warm period, a time of relative stability, gave way to the unpredictable chill of the Little Ice Age. On the steppes, this meant chaos. Droughts ravaged rodent populations, concentrating survivors around dwindling water sources and forcing species into unnatural proximity. Then, sudden floods would drive them onto the open plains in desperate migrations. In both scenarios, the plague cycle was violently disrupted. Starving fleas, their traditional hosts dead or displaced, became less discriminating. They leapt onto anything warm-blooded: a camel, a goat, a horse, or the fur-clad merchant traveling the vast plains. The invisible barrier between animal and human worlds, once a sturdy wall, was dangerously thinning. The second great force was human. This was the era of the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Genghis Khan's descendants had forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific to the borders of Poland. Their conquests were brutal, but the result was an unprecedented era of stability and connectivity across Asia. The ancient Silk Road, once a perilous network of disconnected paths, transformed into a secure, well-maintained superhighway. Mongol logistics masters established a system of relay stations, allowing messengers and merchants to traverse the continent with astonishing speed. Caravans could now cross Asia in months, not years. This new globalized world was a miracle of commerce and cultural exchange, carrying silk from China, spices from the Indies, and ideas from Persia. But it also carried stowaways. The same caravans transporting precious goods also carried grain. And where there was grain, there were rats. Specifically, the black rat, a creature perfectly adapted to human society, an agile climber, and a furtive passenger. Clinging to the fur of these rats were the fleas. A single flea, born on a dying rodent in Central Asia, could now embark on an epic journey, hitching a ride in a sack of wheat, traveling from rat to rat, from caravan to caravan, moving inexorably westward toward a continent that had no memory of its silent bacterial passenger and no immunity whatsoever. The steppe's terrible secret was out. It was traveling at the speed of trade, a slow-motion catastrophe unspooling along the world's most sophisticated commercial network.
By the 1330s, it had reached China. By the 1340s, it was moving through the great trading hubs of Samarkand and Trebizond. And by 1346, it arrived at the gates of Europe. Its dramatic introduction took place at the city of Kaffa, a glittering prize on the Crimean Peninsula, a vital port controlled by the powerful Genoese Republic. Here, in 1345, a formidable Mongol commander laid siege to the city. The siege was long and brutal, a grinding stalemate. Then, something changed. A new and terrible enemy appeared in the Mongol camp: the plague. It spread with terrifying speed, soldiers healthy at morning muster dying by nightfall. The Mongol war machine dissolved from the inside out. Consumed by rage, the Mongol commander ordered his trebuchets to hurl not stones, but the swollen, blackened corpses of his own plague-ridden soldiers over Kaffa's walls. This wasn't sophisticated biological warfare in the modern sense. It was an act of pure, desperate terror. The physical effect of this macabre bombardment was likely limited. The true weapons were not the corpses themselves, but the microscopic passengers they carried, and the slightly larger passengers carried on their clothing and bodies. With every decaying body that landed within the city came a new infusion of infected rats, and more critically, a new population of ravenous, host-seeking fleas. The city's defenders had barred their gates to the Mongol army, but they could not bar them to an enemy the size of a pinhead. The plague was now inside the city. Panic erupted. The defenders who had bravely faced a Mongol horde had no weapon against this. Their only thought was to escape. They scrambled aboard their galleys, desperate to flee the dying city and return to the safety of home. They could not have known that they had become the delivery mechanism. They were no longer merchants. They were messengers of death. And their cargo, far more potent than any silk or spice, was now sealed within the wooden hulls of their ships, ready for its European tour.
The journey from Kaffa to Sicily was a voyage through a floating nightmare. Overcrowded ships, packed with sailors, merchants, and desperate refugees, also carried rats, in the grain stores, in the rigging, in the bilge. The first sailor would fall ill, then another, the disease moving through the confined space with breathtaking efficiency. The rhythmic chanting of oarsmen was replaced by groans of the sick. Decks became charnel houses, bodies lay where they fell. Of the many ships that fled Kaffa, some surely vanished without a trace, ghost ships drifting aimlessly. But some, through sheer desperate will, continued on. In October 1347, a dozen of these spectral, half-manned galleys drifted into the port of Messina, Sicily. It was a familiar and usually welcome sight, but as they drew closer, an eerie silence hung over them. When harbor officials boarded, they were met with a scene from a horrific vision, an overwhelming stench of sickness and decay, decks littered with the dead and dying, the few survivors hollow-eyed with fever, their bodies covered in ghastly black swellings. The Sicilian authorities, horrified, immediately ordered the death ships cast out. But it was already too late. In the few hours the ships had been moored, the escape had begun. Unseen, rats scurried down mooring ropes, melting into the shadows of warehouses and docks. With them came their passengers, fleas starved from their journey, abandoning cooling rat bodies for new warm-blooded hosts among the city's local rat population. The exchange was made. The bacterium had successfully crossed the water. The beachhead was established. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. The arrival of the Black Death wasn't just a physical assault, it was a profound crisis of knowledge, faith, and human understanding. Medieval Europe was built on foundational beliefs about the world, the human body, and God's order. The plague systematically dismantled them all. Medical wisdom inherited from the ancient physician Galen centered on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance, sickness, and imbalance. Physicians, clad in their long robes, observed symptoms like fevers and swellings. They concluded this was a hot and wet disease, an excess of blood, and so they turned to phlebotomy, or bloodletting. They would open a vein, often on the opposite side of the body from the telltale buboes, and drain the patient's blood until they grew faint. With the best intentions, they drained life and strength from the afflicted. If veins weren't an option, leeches were applied. The buboes themselves, the grotesque swellings that gave the bubonic plague its name, were seen as the body's attempt to expel the poison. So physicians would lance them, slicing into the agonizingly swollen lymph nodes to release pus and blood. To draw out more venom, they applied poultices, bizarre concoctions of tree resin, lily root, or even dried human excrement and figs. One desperate treatment involved cutting open a live pigeon and applying its warm, bleeding flesh directly to the bubo, believing the bird would draw out the poison. For the wealthy, remedies grew more exotic, yet no less useless. Potions containing crushed emeralds, or theriac, a complex jam with hundreds of ingredients, including cinnamon, opium, and viper flesh. These were not cures, they were rituals, blind attempts to grasp at meaning in the face of incomprehensible death. The prevailing theory of the plague's cause, embraced by scholar and peasant alike, was the doctrine of miasma, the belief that disease was carried on bad air, a pestilential vapor rising from stagnant water, rotting corpses, or unwholesome planetary alignments. People could smell death, the sweet, cloying odor of decay inescapable. They mistakenly concluded the smell itself was the killer. This flawed premise shaped all public response. Physicians walked with pomanders filled with aromatics pressed to their noses, creating personal bubbles of good air. Cities lit enormous bonfires in the streets, hoping smoke and heat would cleanse the atmosphere. Pope Clement VI, sequestered in Avignon, survived by spending the entire summer between two roaring fires, an accidental but effective measure that likely kept fleas at bay. While people sniffed flowers, the fleas jumped and the bacteria spread. The complete failure of medieval medicine was a devastating blow to intellectual authority. The most famous physician of the age, Guy de Chauliac, openly admitted the futility. Doctors dared not visit the sick for fear of infection, and when they did, they could do nothing for them. If science failed, surely faith would hold. But the Church, God's representative on earth, seemed equally powerless. The Black Death was almost universally understood as flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, a divine punishment for humanity's sins. Priests thundered sermons of condemnation, pointing to vanity, greed, and war. Yet prayers went unanswered. Masses were sung in plague-choked cathedrals to no effect. The sick received last rites and died anyway. Priests themselves perished at catastrophic rates, often the first to fall as they bravely ministered to the dying. In some dioceses, clergy mortality approached 70%, creating a spiritual vacuum filled by barely literate, poorly trained replacements. The Church, the great spiritual fortress, was being hollowed out. Into this vacuum surged the flagellants, a terrifying movement of public self-punishment. These were processions of people, mostly men, who marched from town to town, stripping to the waist and rhythmically whipping themselves with leather scourges embedded with sharp iron points. Their backs became bloody, pulped messes, their ritual an attempt to atone for humanity's sins, to offer their own blood as a sacrifice to an angry God. For terrified townsfolk, this horrifying spectacle seemed like the only hope. But the movement soon became heretical, disrupting services, challenging clerical authority, and, ironically, spreading the very plague they sought to end by moving infected crowds between communities. Pope Clement VI quickly condemned them, recognizing the threat to the Church's authority. Their sacrifices were in vain. The plague did not stop. The initial awe curdled into suspicion, and the flagellants were eventually driven out by force. This crisis of faith wasn't a rejection of God, but a shattering of confidence in the institutions that claimed to understand His will. The plague was indiscriminate, striking devout nuns and drunken sinners, innocent children and corrupt merchants. This randomness was spiritually devastating, suggesting a God who was not just angry, but capricious, distant, perhaps even indifferent. This trauma created a fertile ground for doubt, a crack in the monolithic authority of the Church that would widen for centuries.
With heaven offering no solace and earth no cure, terrified minds turned inward, desperate for an enemy they could understand and fight. They sought a scapegoat. In the landscape of 14th century Europe, that target became the Jewish people. Segregated by faith and custom, subjected to centuries of propaganda, they were the perfect canvas for projected fears. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Jews were poisoning the wells, part of a vast international conspiracy to exterminate Christians. This monstrous accusation required a complete suspension of logic. Jewish communities were also devastated by the plague, often suffering even higher mortality rates in their cramped ghettos. But in mass hysteria, logic is the first casualty. Forced confessions, extracted under torture, were meticulously copied and circulated as official proof of guilt. This ignited pogroms of unimaginable savagery. The violence was often methodical, sanctioned by local guilds and town councils eager to cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders and seize their property. In Basel, hundreds were rounded up and burned alive. In Strasbourg, before the plague even arrived, 2,000 Jews were marched to their own cemetery and incinerated on a massive wooden platform. In Mainz, 6,000 people were exterminated. Entire communities, facing certain death at the hands of the mob, chose to take their own lives. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls declaring the Jews innocent and threatening excommunication, but his decrees were ignored. The persecution was a grim chapter, demonstrating the terrifying power of conspiracy theory to rationalize the irrational. It was easier to believe in human evil than a microscopic organism or inscrutable divine will. The wells remained poisoned, not by any human hand, but by a world fundamentally altered. The most dangerous pestilence of all, perhaps, was the one that fed on fear and infected the human heart. When the Great Silence finally began to recede, as the pestilence burned itself out in one region and moved to the next, the survivors crept out of their homes. They were a stark minority in many places, fewer than half the people who had greeted 1347 still alive to see 1351. They inherited a world that was empty, yet paradoxically full of opportunity. This vast, silent emptiness became the crucible in which the modern world would be forged. For centuries, European life had been built on a rigid feudal pyramid, with serfs tied to the land at its broad base. This system thrived on an abundance of labor and a scarcity of land. The Black Death flipped that equation entirely. Suddenly, labor was the scarce and precious commodity. A lord might own 1,000 acres, but it was worthless without hands to plow, sow, and harvest. The surviving peasants, though uneducated in economics, understood their new power. They were in demand. A peasant might hear that a neighboring lord was offering twice the wages, or even better, freedom from obligations, just a simple contract of labor for coin. For the first time, peasants began to vote with their feet, abandoning ancestral lands, seeking better deals. Lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, were forced to compete.
Wages for agricultural workers skyrocketed, in some places doubling or even tripling. The chains of serfdom began to rust and break. The ruling class was horrified. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. In England, King Edward III enacted the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a spectacularly tone-deaf attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and chain peasants to their land. It was utterly unenforceable. Economic reality, the simple law of supply and demand, was far more powerful than any royal decree. Lords quietly ignored it, paying higher wages to attract workers, and peasants continued to abandon manners that tried to enforce the old ways. The statute only bred resentment, a simmering anger among the peasantry who saw it as an attempt by the rich to deny them their fair share. This tension boiled over, decades later, in events like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. While brutally crushed, the message was clear. The old system was broken. The feudal economy, with its foundation of unpaid labor, was dying, slowly giving way to cash rents and wage labor, the precursor to modern capitalism. The Black Death acted as a ferocious catalyst, accelerating a process that might otherwise have taken centuries, clearing the board for a new game. The Black Death didn't just re-engineer economic logic, it profoundly shaped human biology. It was the single greatest selective pressure event in recent human history, a brutal, continent-wide experiment in survival of the fittest. We, the descendants of those survivors, still carry the results in our blood and bones. Yersinia pestis was terrifyingly effective, but not universally fatal. A small fraction of the population possessed innate biological advantages, subtle variations in their immune systems that gave them a fighting chance. Those who survived were more likely to pass these protective genetic traits to their children. One remarkable example is a genetic mutation known as CCR5 delta 32. This small deletion in a gene coding for a protein on the surface of white blood cells seems to have conferred a significant survival advantage against the plague. People with one copy of this mutation had a better chance of weathering the infection. Those with two copies may have been even more resistant. In the centuries of reoccurring plague, this mutation became more common in Europe. It's a living genetic fossil, a scar left on our DNA by the Great Mortality. In a stunning twist of biological fate, this ancient defense against plague has a modern-day benefit. The same CCR5 protein that Yersinia pestis may have targeted is the primary doorway that the HIV virus uses to enter human cells. A significant percentage of people of European descent today carry the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, rendering them highly resistant to HIV infection. Their medieval ancestors, in their desperate fight for survival against one devastating pandemic, inadvertently bequeathed to them a shield against another 6 centuries later. Beyond biology, the plague forced a revolutionary shift in how society approached sickness itself. The catastrophic failure of medieval medicine spurred a slow, painful reevaluation. The old theories were useless. Desperate physicians seeking answers began to defy religious prohibitions and perform autopsies, needing to see with their own eyes what the disease was doing inside the human body. These early, gruesome explorations were the first tentative steps toward a medicine based on observation and anatomy rather than ancient, unquestioned texts. More importantly, the plague gave birth to the very concept of public health. Before 1347, an individual's health was their own concern. The idea of the state taking responsibility for the collective health of its citizens was entirely novel. But the sheer scale of the Black Death forced civic authorities to act. In Italy's maritime republics, at the crossroads of trade and disease, the first organized responses emerged. The city-state of Ragusa pioneered isolating incoming ships and crews. In 1377, they decreed that anyone arriving from a plague-ridden area had to spend 30 days, a Trentino, in a restricted location outside the city walls. This period was soon extended to 40 days, a quarantino, giving us the word quarantine.
Venice perfected this system, establishing the world's first permanent plague hospital, or lazaretto, in 1423. New government bodies, boards of health, were formed, with extraordinary powers. They could shut down markets, forbid public gatherings, arrange mass burials, and condemn and burn infected clothing. These were the world's first public health officials. The iconic plague doctor, with his long bird-like mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, was an unsettling attempt at personal protective equipment, an early symbol of this new, organized, secular fight against pestilence. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these measures evolved into sophisticated, if ruthless, systems of containment, like the cordon sanitaire, where entire regions were sealed off by armed troops. The final major outbreak in Western Europe, in Marseille in 1720, demonstrated the full power of the modern state's response, erecting a plague wall guarded by soldiers to seal off the infected region. The response was no longer about prayer. It was about borders, guards, and walls. The recurring nightmare of the plague had, over centuries of terror, forced humanity to develop the very tools – quarantine, public health boards, data collection, state-enforced isolation – that form the foundation of modern epidemiology and our ongoing battle against infectious disease. The long shadow of the Black Death taught a terrible lesson. Humanity could learn, adapt, and eventually fight back. The Black Death was not merely a tragic episode in history. It was a biological cataclysm that served as a brutal reprogrammer for an entire continent. It didn't just decimate populations, it fundamentally rewrote the rules of society, economy, and even biology. The silent, invisible killer didn't discriminate, challenging the very hierarchies of power, faith, and knowledge that had defined the medieval world. It forced humanity to confront its own vulnerability, leading to a profound crisis of belief and, tragically, a descent into fearful prejudice. But from the ashes and bone dust, something new emerged. The massive demographic shift empowered the common person, slowly breaking the chains of serfdom and valuing human labor in a way unseen before. It sparked new economic models and reshuffled wealth, creating the fertile ground for the Renaissance's explosion of art, science, and humanism. Crucially, it forced humanity to learn, to observe, and to organize, giving birth to the essential tools of public health that protect us to this day. And in our very DNA, we carry a silent genetic shield, a testament to our ancestors' desperate fight for survival, a reminder that the past echoes in our present in ways we can barely comprehend. The Black Death was not just an end, it was a brutal, horrifying, yet ultimately transformative beginning. Its legacy is etched into our institutions, our science, our art, and the very cells of our bodies. It's a stark reminder of the fragile balance between humanity and the natural world, and the immense power of an unseen enemy to reshape everything we know. If this journey through the past has gripped you, if it's made you see the profound connections between ancient plagues and our modern world, then hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden currents of history, and tell me in the comments below, what aspect of the Black Death's legacy do you find most astonishing? Until next time, stay curious and remember how profoundly resilient and vulnerable humanity truly is.